Greetings, fellow teachers, and welcome to Day 4 of the Holocaust Center's Teachers Institute. This is Mitch Bloomer, and today's presentation is about the progress of the final solution in the Holocaust during World War II. This is a companion to the piece that was posted on Tuesday, which dealt with the Nazi era before World War II. And just like the presentation on Tuesday, this one is actually going to deal with two different eras of the Holocaust, two different phases. But before we get into that, I want to give you something that I promised while I was talking to you on Wednesday. There is um, a little one-slide iteration of the Holocaust I often use with students to help them understand how important it is to look at how it developed, how the Holocaust developed through a series of sequential stages from beginning to end. And what I usually do is I begin with what you see on the screen right now. And I think what you see here, these 4 bullet points, are what people generally think about when they hear the term the Holocaust. They think about Jews being physically attacked. They think about Jews being forced to flee their homes or their country, pushed out by force. They think, of course, about the concentration camps and Jews being put to slave labor. And also they think about the ghettos and incarceration there. But I think most of all, people think about Jews being subjected to the mass murder program and all of the different ways in which that was carried out. But I think it's very important for students to realize that none of these things could have been done if there hadn't been a lot of things that happened beforehand that set the stage for what would come later. And so I ask students to speculate as to what would fit in the blank space. And then after I take some answers, I reveal what really did happen first. Um, so long before any Jewish people were subjected to mass murder, they were attacked with language and demeaning imagery designed to dehumanize them and to denigrate and uh, separate them from the remainder of the German people. They were segregated from society, pushed to the fringes of the community. And then, through a series of laws and social discrimination and economic persecution, they were denied jobs and opportunities and subject to discrimination, deprived of their citizenship, and all of this going on while they were subjected to an atmosphere of sporadic, violent intimidation. And I would like to suggest that it's one of the most important teaching lessons of the Holocaust that students understand that the things in red at the bottom really could not have happened had the things in white at the top not come first. And those things at the top are they overlap a bit, but they are to a degree sequential. So the lesson here is that when anyone witnesses an individual or a group of people being attacked with dehumanizing and demeaning language, being lied about, with their reputation damaged, um, being subjected to propaganda that's designed to destroy, that right then is the moment when resistance should take place. If that's allowed to occur, every sequential step becomes easier to ignore by those who are not targeted until it becomes too late effectively to oppose the persecuting power. So having said that, let's go back and look at what we saw on Tuesday's pre-recorded session. On Tuesday, we looked at the first stage of the Holocaust when Nazi Germany um, subjected Jews to segregation policies designed to try to force them to choose to leave Germany. And that would be the first two stages that you see on the slide here. Today we're going to look at the last two. Um, and the key distinction or the key pivotal moment here is that World War II began in Europe when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Prior to September 1st, 1939, as much as Nazi Germany wanted Jews to leave, they really had very little ability to force any other nations to take refugee Jews in. Therefore, they were, to a degree, stuck and not able to pursue their policy of eliminating the Jews or removing the Jews as forcefully as they would have liked. The coming of the war will change that because now that they have occupied the western half of Poland, they have an area that's not going to be a part of the, incorporated into the Reich, that they can use as a place where they can force Jews to leave. So now you're going to have a period where expulsion is occurring. And I'm going to go through that in some detail um, because there are different phases within the expulsion period. But for the most part, we would say it lasted from the fall of 1939 through the middle of 1941. And then there's about a 6 month transition period where Nazi German policy is moving away from what we would call a territorial solution, that is, forcing Jews to go somewhere else, and transitioning to a mass killing and genocidal program. And of course, the huge question is, what are the forces that drive that change? Um, we wouldn't want anyone to assume that this is a change that happens easily or quickly, or that there aren't any roadblocks that have to be overcome on the part of the Nazi planners and those who are going to carry out the policies. So, um, anti-Jewish policy does change as a result of both the onset of the war in 1939 and then the intensification of the war with Operation Barbarossa, which is when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941. So this is how the beginning of the war actually changes the nature of the Jewish question. First of all, the idea that Jews are going to be able to choose to leave Germany, even because of increasingly difficult living conditions, um, begins to fade because it's much more difficult for people to move from one country to another in wartime. Wartime tends to close countries' borders. On top of that, the number of Jewish people that Germany is going to have to try to remove increases dramatically with the occupation of Poland. I mean, Germany had only about 525 or 530,000 Jews in 1933, and they've managed to reduce that number by about half by the time the war begins. And then the moment they cross the border, or within a few days of crossing the border, they've added another 2 million Jewish people. And when they invade further east into the Soviet Union 15 months later or so, um, they're going to add another 3.5 to 4 million Jewish people. So the numbers are going to change. And then, of course, war conditions um, that occur because of the way that the campaigns are developing are actually in the long run going to doom the idea that Nazi Germany is going to be able to find a place where Jewish people can be forcibly removed to, and then they're going to be left with a question of what now. So, but here's a remarkable quote that I wanted to share with you, and I really think that we should take this seriously. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS, and probably in the history of the final solution, he's the most important figure that we need to pay attention to, next to Adolf Hitler himself. And in fact, one historian has said regarding the anti-Jewish policy and the implementation of the final solution, if you want to see at any given moment what Hitler was thinking, watch what Himmler was doing. So he is very important here. And of course, like other top Nazi leaders, he could, in public speaking, lie. or conceal or prevaricate or use euphemisms to talk about anti-Jewish policy. But this quote here is from a secret memorandum to Hitler, and there's no reason to believe that any of this language is anything other than what Heinrich Himmler meant at the moment that he wrote this, which was in May of 1940. And notice that late into the Nazi era, he still feels as what he describes in these words: I hope that the concept of Jews will be completely extinguished through the possibility of large-scale emigration of all Jews to Africa or some other colony. And he goes on to say, cruel and tragic as every individual case may be, this method is mildest and best. Now here's the part you really want to pay attention to. If out of inner conviction we reject the Bolshevist method of physical destruction of a people as un-Germanic and impossible. So here you have the man who, in about 15 months, is going to be, well, yeah, in about 15 months, is going to be responsible for the onset and the application of the final solution of the Jewish question, genocidal mass murder on a continental scale, saying that the physical destruction of a people is un-Germanic and impossible. That just raises this enormous question: what changed? Um, if he really felt this way, why did his opinion change, and why did he think that what had previously been um, not possible now becomes possible? Well, first of all, when Germany invaded Poland, uh, they saw possibilities opening up um, to find a territorial solution to their Jewish problem. And this is a strange phenomenon that just is true about Nazi Germany. Um, Various leaders, regional leaders like Gauleiters or SS leaders in various branches and departments, understand that the way to get ahead is to realize what the leader wants and then to be the one who's the most aggressive and most successful in finding ways to implement policy. And so you have a variety of German leaders, as soon as Polish territory becomes available, thinking, well, I'm going to free my region of Jews. I'm going to make mine Judenrein. And so they begin to look for opportunities just to deport Jews into the newly conquered territory. And there's a brief period of time that we call the wild deportations, where some leaders are trying to do it without any coordination, um, just to see if they can't get a jump on everyone else. Um, then this kind of morphs into two very poorly thought out possibilities of creating reservations for Jews. Hitler once mentioned that he thought that the Jewish problem might be solved the same way that America solved its Indian problem, with reservations. And let that one sink in for just a moment. Um, but there were attempts to deport Jews to the Nisko region and to the Lublin region. Um, but of course, the German officials who are actually responsible for administering those regions bitterly complain that they can't handle all these Jewish people being dumped on them. And so there's a thought perhaps that the government needed to slow down, plan a little bit more, figure out how to incorporate the movement of Jewish people into a larger plan of racially reorganizing the continent anyway, with the movement of people who have some ties to Germanic blood from the east back towards German lands, back towards the Reich, moving Polish people out of their homes in western Poland to make that territory available for German colonization. And they really are going to move people around, um, again, on a continental scale, and not only the Jews. Now, if you read Nazi literature on the Jews, It's clear that they want them out of Europe altogether at some point. Um, but they're willing to think about doing it in stages. Um, so, for example, um, there was an idea that the Jews could perhaps be moved to the island of Madagascar off the coast of Africa. And you'll notice from the slide that I put the date for the beginning of this back as early as 1938. Interestingly enough, the Nazis aren't the only ones who are thinking about this. There were people in France, there were people in Poland who thought that Jews had no place in the future of Europe, who thought maybe that there would be a good Madagascar would be a good place for a Jewish colony, and so for a variety of reasons, that becomes entertained as a possibility. Now, Madagascar was controlled as a French colony, so when France fell to Germany in the spring and summer of 1940 in the war, German planners thought, okay, Madagascar's available to us now. And as soon as we can, we'll start shipping Jews there. And eventually we'll make a colony of about 4 million Jews. Now, don't think that that was going to be a place where Jews would live and prosper and be able to build their own society. It was going to be an SS run, island sized concentration camp. And so, in all likelihood, that plan, had it been executed, would have been genocidal ultimately anyway, even though it wasn't, specifically planned out to be such. The problem that German planners had was that although Madagascar might be available, there was no route to get Jews there unless Great Britain was defeated in the war. The British Navy is too powerful to sweep away, and so an ocean route to Madagascar isn't going to work. And any overland route is going to have to go through Egypt, which is also a British colony. So when it becomes clear that Britain is not going to capitulate, the Madagascar plan really goes on the shelf. Um, then, when Germany pushed into the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa, there was about a 6 month period where the Nazis thought, you know what, we can ship Jews into Siberia or far east or far north, um, over the Ural Mountains, out of Europe altogether, and that'll be the way we'll solve the Jewish problem with some territory that we can get to through our military conquest. But the fact of the matter is, of course, is that what appeared to be an easy victory coming over the Soviet Union turned out to be anything but, and that plan came to nothing as well. Um, so the territorial solution is frustrated, and the question is, what is Nazi Germany going to do in the meantime? So let's back up just for a moment and look at what policy actually does develop in this third stage. Um, well, there were no ghettos in Germany. Right after Kristallnacht, at a meeting of Nazi leaders, it had been proposed perhaps to create ghettos for Jews in Germany, and Reinhard Heydrich, who really is angling to be and soon will be in charge of anti-Jewish policy for the SS under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, he makes it very clear. He says, as for the matter of ghettos, we don't want to do that. It would be a hideout for criminals, and it would be the source of epidemics. It's better that the Jews are split up throughout the population. That way the watchful eyes of our whole country can keep them under control. Better that than putting them all in a single area where there wouldn't be enough officials to be able to check on their daily activities. So Heydrich says absolutely not to ghettos, and ghettos are never established in Germany. But when the German army goes into Poland, they have a change of heart on the idea of ghettos. Um, and so within 3 weeks of the German occupation of Poland, Heydrich issues an order for Jews to be concentrated in ghettos. And the regulations for concentrating the Jews in ghettos are that they should be concentrated near rail lines, any Jewish communities that have less than 500 people are just going to be dissolved, and those people would be incorporated into a larger area nearby. Um, every Jewish community is going to be required to have its own council of elders called a Judenrat, and and the Nazis are going to use Jewish leadership councils to make them responsible for carrying out German orders. Now, Heydrich points out in this memo to leaders that this is a policy that has both an immediate goal and then a final aim. And the final aim is secret, and he doesn't describe what that final aim is going to be. But I don't think that it would have been too much of a surprise to any of the leaders of the occupation that that final goal is the ultimate removal of Jews from Poland and from Europe altogether. Um, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, different Gauleiters or different leaders of regions are going to be looking to get rid of their Jews. So three very prominent people involved in this is Arthur Greiser, who is in charge of the Wartgau region, and Albert Forster, who is in charge of Danzig in West Prussia. These two provinces, although they had been part of Poland, are actually slated to be incorporated into the Reich immediately. And Adolf Hitler told both of these men, you have 10 years to make your areas free of Jews, and all I want you to do is get it done. I'm not going to ask you how you do it. In fact, he didn't say just free of Jews, but ethnically pure German. And of course, that would mean dealing with a lot of Polish people too. Now, Hans Frank is in charge of the central part of Poland, which the Germans refer to as the general government. That area is not slated for incorporation into the Reich. Nevertheless, Frank was under the impression that his area was going to be one of the first to be free of Jews. Actually, it turns out that it becomes the area where most Jews end up being sent. But he complains about this bitterly, and these other two men want to send their Jews into the general government, and they end up, there's a lot of infighting that goes on between them. There's also a lot of infighting that goes on between Greiser and Forster themselves, because each man takes a very different position on how to make their areas ethnically pure German. Um, there was the thought that there were a lot of people who had Polish citizenship in those areas who might have ethnic German background, and they should be won over and brought back into the people. And if they couldn't be persuaded, then their children could be taken from them and raised as Germans. And so Greiser implements a policy to try to carefully examine whatever they could find to assess the racial purity of the Polish people in his area, to incorporate those who actually meet the definition. And that's his way of doing it. Forster, however, thinks that's too much bother, and is willing to just put out feelers to Polish people. Hey, if you'd like to be ethnically German, and you're willing to sign an affidavit, then I'll rubber stamp you, and I'll make my province ethnically pure more quickly than my rival. Of course, Greiser thinks that Forster's making a mockery out of this. He appeals to Heinrich Himmler. Forster says, I don't answer to Himmler, I answer to Hitler, and he told me he wasn't going to ask how I got it done, and the two guys infight. So I'm just telling you this story because I want you to realize that there isn't a single view in the German leadership at this point that's saying, here's what we must do to deal with the Jewish problem. And so it becomes quite chaotic. So as an intermediary measure, this incorporation of the Jews into ghettos is not really considered to be a stage in the process of destroying the Jews, but rather an intermediate step that can be implemented while they're figuring out what they're going to do. And ghettos become a policy but that is something that is a work in progress. You can see in the map how many ghettos are established, and this is just major ghettos. And you can see that the ghetto policy extends over time and geographically into different regions. So the effect of ghettoizing the Jews and requiring a Jewish council to lead is that the ghettos could be used to plunder the Jews, take their goods, force them to provide labor. Um, Policies could also be implemented through Jewish leaders, not so much to disguise that these are German orders, but to provide a buffer so that the German leaders don't have to actually uh, implement the policies entirely on their own. It also is a good divide and conquer technique for the Nazis because many Jewish people in the ghettos get as mad at the ghetto leadership as they are at the Germans who are ruling over them. Also, any attempts at resistance are considered to be um, the problem of the whole ghetto, and collective guilt leads to a policy of collective responsibility. In this way, the Nazis forced the Jews to cooperate in their own destruction. Now, I feel really bad about the fact that because this Teachers Institute is much shorter, we're not going to have a great opportunity to look at the breadth and the depth of Jewish resistance. And the ghettos are the place where we can see Jewish resistance most clearly because Jewish resistors were able to leave the greatest amount of evidence behind in these areas and engage in the widest variety of possible acts of resistance. So even though we're not going to really be able to have a whole session on Jewish resistance, we certainly should look at what that resistance would be like. And I'm just going to say, as a general rule, that resistance is going to be um, whatever Jewish people think that they can get away with that will work towards their ultimate goal of survival. And to survive not only physically, but to survive with Jewish identity and values intact. That's not going to be the same everywhere, and not everyone's going to agree on what that type of resistance should look like. But that's going to be the motivating factor there. And the ghettos face enormous challenges. You can see some of them here. Overcrowding, starvation, lack of basic necessities, catastrophic sanitation conditions, brutal forced labor, separation from the outside world, including from Jews and other communities, and then finally, deportation to unknown destinations. The question is this already the genocide? Um, by the definition of genocide that is current in international law, this actually would constitute genocide. But I think in the mind of the Nazi planners, they have not yet reached the decision to commit genocidal mass murder against the Jews. So what's happening is the conditions that they create in the ghettos are moving them very close to that decision. And in some ways, I think, at least with some Nazi leaders, they make the decision tacitly by carrying out these policies which create mass death before they actually admit to themselves what they're actually doing. Um, and there's a lot of evidence from the ghettos. And so I'm just showing you a few photos here. Um, Arrival, chaos, uh, forced labor, um, barriers, and the warning signs that were ubiquitous, both for people inside the ghetto and for people outside. Um, Labor in the ghetto. Sometimes it was not productive, but a lot of times um, German companies or the German military actually made use of ghetto labor, like you can see with the production of uniforms in the Belgian ghetto and of course in the Łódź ghetto. Textile. It was a textile center before the war, and it becomes a textile production center for Jewish slave labor in the ghetto. Of course, the conditions deteriorate to the point where hunger is ubiquitous and desperation is ever present, and the leaders of the ghettos try their best. Um, from the top down and also from House committees to provide for the basic needs of people, but they really don't have the resources to do so. And then finally, of course, the dread of the ghetto is deportation. Um, Now, deportations don't start until the summer of 1942 in most of the ghettos, and at first, the people in the ghettos don't know what deportation means, but it won't be long before they find out that deportation means death. So, of course, Jewish people did fight back in the ghettos. They did everything they could to preserve their lives and their communal life. They did spiritual resistance through religious, educational, and cultural activities. They smuggled food and resources. They tried to escape. They tried to hide. And they engaged in armed resistance whenever they possibly could. The ghettos farthest to the east are most likely to be able to do it because they were closer to Soviet territory. They were closer to heavily wooded areas, and um, and there was just a greater level of knowledge of what the Germans were up to because the ghettos in the Far East were established after the first wave of shootings by the Einsatzgruppen. So the people in the ghetto were fully aware of the murderous intent of the Nazis, which in the areas further to the west, that might not have been known quite as quickly. Nevertheless, in all of the ghettos, there are various attempts to resist, such as spreading underground news, like the Oneg Shabbat organization, documenting the conditions of the ghetto. And just before I move off the ghettos, I wanted to point out that um, the first armed uprising um, against the Nazis by any occupied people in an organized fashion was done by the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, and one of the leaders of the Jewish Fighting Organization left behind this very moving testimony in a letter where he says, "The dream of my life has risen to become fact. Self-defense in the ghetto will have been a reality. Jewish armed resistance and revenge are facts. I've been a witness to the magnificent heroic fighting of Jewish men in battle." To be fair, he should have said Jewish women as well, because Jewish women also fought in the ghetto. But having said that, um, this idea among some people, and you even hear it some from students, that the Jews went like sheep to the slaughter, they didn't fight back. Why didn't they fight back? It just simply isn't true. Now, of course, the ghetto uprisings, and the Warsaw one was not the only one, brought massive crackdowns and recriminations from the occupying Germans. And for the most part, you can date fighting resistance in any particular ghetto or location to when the people find out that mass killing is the fate, regardless, because then there's nothing to lose. Before that, um, you're trying to survive, and since a revolt is almost certain to fail, I mean, it's not possible for ghetto fighters to overthrow the German occupation. Even whole countries take years to do that. Um, and we're talking about the most powerful countries in the world, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. A handful of resistance fighters from a ghetto aren't going to get the job done. But as the Germans are cracking down on these revolts, Hans Frank makes the statement, that it's very clear that they're sentencing the 1.2 million Jews who live in the general government to death by conditions, by the conditions in the ghetto. And if they don't die from the hunger and from the deprivation, then other anti-Jewish measures will have to be enacted. So one could look at a statement like that and say they have really moved to the very, very cusp of preparing to commit genocidal mass murder. Nevertheless, it still leaves us with the question, why did they feel compelled to take that final step? They really did have the Jews in the ghettos for the most part under control. They could have waited until they achieved victory in the war and then come up with a more permanent plan to remove Jews to some faraway location. Why didn't they do it? And so here's why they take the final step. First of all, all of their prior solutions that you saw at the slide at the beginning, step number 1, step number 2, step number 3, has not managed to accomplish the ultimate goal of removal of the Jews. Also, they've begun to engage in murder campaigns. Um, the euthanasia program that Dr. Stufflet mentioned um, was begun in 1939, and when Germany invaded Poland, they also had the intent to destroy the Polish state and reduce the people to a permanent slave caste. While they didn't have genocidal intent against the Poles, they did want to destroy their intellectual and their cultural and their religious leadership, so that there would be no possible center of a Polish resistance. And they committed mass murder on a large scale against Poles. Then, at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, when they invaded the Soviet Union, in the first couple of months, they took 3 million approximately Soviet prisoners of war, far more than they were prepared to handle, and they subjected them to mass murder. In fact, the initial expansion of Auschwitz, when it was being rapidly expanded to hold 100,000, the Germans originally thought that that was going to be mostly Soviet prisoners of war, but before they managed to finish expanding the camp, the war in the East had begun to change, and they weren't taking the number of prisoners that they had. Now we're going to look at this next bullet point a little bit more. Adolf Hitler actually briefed his generals in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and he issued what's come to be known as the Commissar Order, that changed the nature of the way Germany would fight the war in the East. And that also helps lead to the final solution in a very profound way. Then you have the Nazi ideology itself. And we like to call it self-radicalizing, because if you actually believed, if a person actually believed what the Nazis said about Jewish people, they were an element of decomposition threatening to destroy society. They were akin to a contagious disease like the plague, and as a result of that, why would anybody be satisfied with anything less than the most total form of destruction? And then finally, there's this thing known as Hitler's prophecy. We'll take a look at that as well. In fact, that'll be next here. So on January 30th, 1939, Hitler gave a very long speech before the Reichstag, and this is part of it. He says, "In the course of my life, I have very often been a prophet and usually been ridiculed for it. During the time of my struggle for power, it was, in the first instance, only the Jewish race that received my prophecies with laughter when I said that one day I would take over the leadership of the state, and with it that of the whole nation, and that I would then, among other things, settle the Jewish problem." Actually, I think that's an entire fantasy. I don't think Jews were laughing at him. I don't think that if there was laughter, they were the only ones. But he goes on to say, "Today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside of Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevizing of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." Now, Hitler makes that claim in January 30th, 1939. The war will start in 6 months. The thing about it is that when Germany invaded Poland, they don't think that that's the beginning of a world war. They think that this is the beginning of another stage in their settling accounts in Europe. And so one of the questions that has to come is, what do the Nazis think World War means, and when do they believe that they're engaged in it? I'll come back to that. Now, I mentioned earlier that Hitler's euthanasia decree provides a precedent, and in fact, here you can see that that he's giving German officials permission to do something which would normally be beyond the scope of their activities. Physicians don't normally kill their patients. and soldiers don't normally kill civilians. At least that's the rules of war. So this idea that the Fuhrer is going to expand the task of a group of people to achieve a particular Nazi ideological goal, the precedent is set here all the way back in 1939. Now, that commissar order I mentioned earlier is actually where Hitler is telling his generals that he doesn't expect that the Soviet soldiers and their political leaders are going to obey the normal rules of war. Um, so he doesn't think that they should respect them either. Um, he says in the fight against Bolshevism, it's not to be expected that the enemy will act in accordance with the principles of humanity or international law. Um, we know who these guys are. They're going to be cruel and inhuman. Therefore, we should do it too. The barbaric Asiatic fighting methods are originated by the political commissars. And he goes on to say, therefore, when they are picked up in battle or resistance, they are, as a matter of principle, to be finished immediately with a weapon. So when communist political officials, commissars, are taken in battle, they are simply to be executed. Um, and Hitler goes on to explain this is okay because um, the Soviet Union didn't sign um, any like the Hague Convention principles about the rules of conduct in war. And here's a statement by Hitler. He says the war against Russia cannot be fought in knightly fashion. The struggle is one of ideologies and racial differences and will have to be waged with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting hardness. All officers will have to get rid of any old-fashioned ideas they may have. I realize that the necessity for conducting such warfare is beyond the comprehension of you generals, but I must insist that my orders be followed without complaint. And he goes, any German soldier who breaks international law will be pardoned. Russia did not take part in the Hague Convention and therefore has no rights under it. So Hitler isn't even of the mindset that there is any such thing as a moral law which a state must be obliged to obey. Now you can follow directly from Hitler's Commissar order to the instructions that Heydrich gives to the Einsatzgruppen in the occupation of territory behind the Wehrmacht as they push into Soviet territory with Operation Barbarossa, and they are given permission. They're given the edict um, to execute people's commissars, Jews in party and state employment, and other radical elements. And testimony from one of the men in the Einsatzgruppen, one of the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen, Otto Ohlendorf, makes it very clear that they understood what they were being told to do. Um, at this time, we were already being instructed about the tasks of exterminating the Jews. It was stated that Eastern Jewry was the intellectual reservoir of Bolshevism, and therefore, in the Fuhrer's opinion, must be exterminated. And Ohlendorf is making it very clear that there was no misunderstanding as to what the Einsatzgruppen were being told to do. Now, right around this same time, the Deputy Fuhrer, Hermann Goering, is uh, giving an order to Heydrich to implement a final solution, to plan and implement the final solution of the Jewish question. He's actually told him earlier to do this all the way back in 1939, but at that point they were thinking specifically only about emigration and forcing the Jews into a territorial solution. And now he says, um, now with this new opportunity, I commission you to carry out all the necessary preparations, and and let's bring about the total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence. And so Heydrich is going to be the point man here. Um, and so we're going to see the gradual onset of the final solution between June the 22nd, 1941, beginning with the invasion of the Soviet Union, and this implementation happening gradually without necessarily being announced. There's not a single order that we know. that sets it in motion, but rather a confluence of things coming together. And so this final solution is actually going to begin to be carried out in four overlapping stages. First of all, as I hope you picked up on, uh, the German policies that are leading to mass death in the ghettos are already really, by the modern definition of genocide, the beginning of genocidal mass killing. Whether the Germans have admitted it to themselves yet or not, it actually is. And we're going to see in a statement from the Wannsee conference in just a few slides that they begin to recognize this. Then you have the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads, and they go into action on June 22nd, and they begin shooting Jews right away. But we don't really consider that the beginning of genocidal mass murder, because for the first weeks they're only shooting young men that they think might be potential resistors. But by the end of August, we can see towns beginning in Ukraine where they begin rounding up and executing men, women, and children without distinction. And that really looks to us like a major turning point into genocide. Um, then, as Richards described yesterday, you saw that the Germans were very concerned with the impact of mass killing by shooting on their own men. Um, and so they looked for a cleaner, neater way, killing by gas in camps that are specially either purpose built for that purpose, or parts of camps that are dedicated to that purpose. Um, the death camp period goes from December of 1941 through January 27th, which with the evacuation of Auschwitz. And then the last stage is the death marches, where Jews are being removed from camps in the East, labor, those who are still alive doing labor, and force marched under brutal conditions back to Germany to avoid allowing them to be liberated, um, which is an ironic act, but one that is rightly considered part of the final solution. So here's a map showing the path of the Einsatzgruppen into the occupied Soviet Union, and if you look at the path of Einsatzgroup C, you can see they take you directly to the city that Greg Dawson's mom lived in and family, and you can see that that was right there, um, in the line of advance for Einsatzgroup C. And this map, by the way, is only a very selective um, representation of the number of places that where mass killings were done by the Einsatzgruppen. Mass graves are still being discovered, even to this day, and that was after Germany trying to erase the evidence. That I'll also describe again in just a few minutes. Um, there's a lot of photographs. This was all supposed to be very secret. It's amazing how much testimony there is. It's amazing how many photographs there are, given the fact that this was a state secret, and the people engaged in doing this work were not supposed to photograph it, write about it, or talk about it. You can see that's an order that wasn't entirely followed. Um, the picture in the lower left was the execution site at Babi Yar in outside of Kiev in Ukraine. But there are other mass killing locations, like the Seventh Fort in Lithuania. And you heard mentioned yesterday about how there were a lot of collaborators who were not Germans and not Nazis, like this man that you can see in Kovno, who is not German but enthusiastically engaged in killing Jews with an iron bar, and enjoyed the applause of a crowd while he was doing it. Um, Now, in the end, Nazi Germany realized that using shooting was not going to get them all the way to the elimination of the Jewish population, and that it had some negative drawbacks, and one of them was all the evidence being left behind. Um, the official who was actually in command at the Babi Yar massacre was this man that you see on the screen, Paul Blöbel. Blobel, and later he becomes the commander of Action 1005, whose remit was to go to all of the execution sites with a team of slave laborers, dig up the bodies and burn them and dispose of the ash. He even had a specially constructed bone crushing machine so that pieces of bone that didn't burn could be ground to powder and hidden. And they worked for 2 years on this project, and they did work hard, but they couldn't find all the sites and they couldn't get to all of them, and much evidence ended up being left behind. Now there was a meeting that was scheduled for December the 8th, 1941, to be chaired by Heydrich, uh, to discuss the organization of um, of the final solution of the Jewish problem. It had to be postponed because something significant happened on December 7th, 1941. I think you know what that is. So it was postponed for 6 weeks to January 20th. At the Wannsee Conference, by the way, for years the Wannsee Conference was described as the meeting where the final solution was planned. That is not by any stretch of the imagination true. The final solution is actually already underway at this point. It is the meeting at which organizational responsibility is delineated, and the SS under Heydrich make it clear that they're the ones in charge, and all Jewish policy is going to be run through them. Um, One of the things, though, that Heydrich says, which I think is interesting to note, um, is that he says that Jews are going to be sent to the east. Able-bodied Jews are going to be separated by sex, and they're going to be sent to work and on tough construction projects like work on roads. And he says, in the course of which action, doubtless a large portion will be eliminated by natural causes. That is, they're going to die from the conditions. But then he goes on to say, the possible final remnant will, since it will undoubtedly consist of the most resistant portion, have to be treated accordingly because it is the product of natural selection and would, if released, act as the seed of a new Jewish revival. And that is just a primer on Nazi ideology. That's Nazi ideology 101. And so you can see the belief system of the Nazis here is actually leading them to the idea that they must kill the Jews because any who survive will be the strongest and healthiest, and they will be a germ cell of new resistance in the future. Um, and so this idea of evacuating the Jews to the east simply becomes a euphemism for killing them. Um, Now, we can find a very interesting set of recorded speeches by Heinrich Himmler um, in the very heart of the killing program. And just in case anyone wants to deny that Germany was actually engaged in genocidal mass killing of the Jews, um, this speech was not only recorded in written form, it's actually recorded on tape, and you can hear Himmler's own voice as he gives this address. And in it, he says, look, I've got something I want to talk to you about together here because we're all SS men. We can talk about it openly. But when we're out in the public, we'll never speak about it. I'm talking about the extermination of the Jewish people. Oh, sure, all of our people back at home say the Jewish people's being exterminated. It's part of our plan. We're getting rid of the Jews. It's no big deal. And then he says, along they all come, all the 80 million upright Germans, and each one has his decent Jew. They say all the others are swine, but this guy's okay. And he says, none of these guys has ever seen it. They haven't endured it. He says, you and I, most of you will know what it means to see 100 bodies lie, or 500 or 1,000. And for us to have gone through this, except for a few cases of weakness, we've been able to remain decent doing this. It's made us hard. It's a page of glory in our history, but one that we'll never write, it'll never be mentioned. And we had to do it because we know what kind of a condition we'd be in today if we still had Jews in the midst of us while the war is turning hard. It would be like World War I back in 1916 and 1917. And by the way, the loss in World War I always motivated the Nazis. They always said it's not going to be that way this time. We're not going to lose the home front. It was an existential fear to them, and Himmler's speaking right to it. Now he finishes up this section of his speech where he says, we had the moral right, the duty to our people to do this, to kill this people who would kill us. But we don't want at the end to get sick and die from the disease that we've exterminated. And by that he's talking about stealing from them or killing them only for profit, but instead that they're doing it out of love of their country. He says, but altogether we can say we've carried out this most difficult task for the love of our people, and we've suffered no defect within us, in our soul, or in our character. Now I just shared that with you because I wanted you to see, um, just where Nazi ideology leads these people in their thinking process to a point where murder to them doesn't even seem wrong. Now, 2 days later, he must have been asked by somebody after that speech, well, why do we have to kill the kids? And so he addressed that 2 days later. He said, we came to the question, how is it with the women and children? He said, I decided to find a clear solution here as well. I didn't consider myself justified to kill the men and allow the children to grow up because they would be avengers of their parents in the future, and it would be harder on our kids and our grandkids later. So the difficult decision had to be taken to make this people disappear from the earth. And that then is the ultimate redefinition of removal. What had at one point been segregation from within the German population now becomes removal from the earth in its entirety. Um, Now, in order to make this happen in a more systematic way and in a more organized way, and in a way that's easier to protect the sensibilities of the killers, the SS brings the concentration camp system into the final solution. Now you can see here that the camps went all the way back to 1933, and while Jews were always there to some extent, it's not until 1942 that implementing genocide becomes something that's a part of at least some of the camps, and by the end, quite a few of them. Now, there are concentration camps, there are camps that are mainly labor camps, there are camps in Western Europe that are designed to help move the Jews eastward, that are holding areas, and then they're the actual Vernichtungslager, the death camps, and you can see I have them listed here. Um, Most camps were not officially death camps, but all camps were places that were so brutal that many people died. Um, as it is today, a lot of American soldiers who were veterans of the war talk about liberating death camps, and none of the actual official death camps were liberated by American soldiers because all the death camps were in the East. But I would never make that argument in front of the soldiers because what they saw at Dachau and Buchenwald and Mauthausen and other places like that, one can certainly imagine that to the soldiers, these must be death camps. And many of them were under the assumption, given the ugliness of what they saw, that this is where the Nazis had been carrying out the mass killing of the Jews. Actually, Jews who were liberated from the Western camps had only been there a matter of days or weeks, having been forced on death marches back from Eastern Europe. All of the actual death camps that were located in Eastern Europe were liberated by the Red Army simply because of the geography of Europe. So here you can see the death camps as they were listed, and you can see that Chelmno was already in operation for 43 days prior to the Wannsee Conference. So the final solution doesn't begin with the death camps. It is the death camps are a transition away from the Holocaust by bullets for efficiency and for concern for the killers. Uh, you can see the map. The yellow line is the boundary of pre-war Poland, and you can see that all of the death camps were located in Poland. And I want to point out that we should never use the language Polish death camps. There are no Polish death camps. There are only German death camps in occupied Poland, um, because that's the only fair way to describe them. Chelmno didn't have fixed location gas chambers. It had mobile gas vans, and gas vans were also used in other locations as well. Um, but the gassing was kind of invented on the fly, and so there are different iterations of it. Gas vans used carbon monoxide gas as a product of exhaust. The killing of the handicapped also used carbon monoxide gas, but it was factory produced and compressed into bottles and released, sort of like carbon dioxide is for making carbonated beverages. Um, but that was a cumbersome process to deport to transport to the east. So in the eastern camps, what are called the Reinhard camps, carbon monoxide was generated by engine exhaust. Um, Zyklon, however, was chemically produced as an insecticide, and the B level version of it was used for killing people. And that was done at Auschwitz and Majdanek and a few other locations. Um, Camps were also organized for profit, so prisoners taken there were also despoiled of their property, and you can see in Auschwitz alone there was a section for the handling of loot. It had 30 buildings. When the Germans were evacuating it, they failed to destroy 6 of them, and within only those 6, you can see how much was left over. And there were regular train loads of goods sent from Auschwitz back to Germany. So the amount of stealing that went on um, was enormous. And so much so that there are many people who believe that stealing from the Jews was one of the major motives of the Holocaust. And I think that it was mostly their racial ideology, but certainly they were willing to profit, notwithstanding what Heinrich Himmler said. And in fact, he would have believed that stealing for the state was acceptable, stealing for individual enrichment was a crime. Of course, we mentioned the death marches already, and you can see some photos of that. The irony of the death marches, of course, is that Nazi Germany had spent almost its entire history from 1933 to near the end of 1944 trying to get the Jews out of Germany and out of German lands altogether. And in the last months of the war, they bring them back because they don't have any more territory to hold them, and if they leave them behind, they'll be liberated. So they bring them back into Germany, and it's an irony almost too bitter to speak. Here you can see some of the routes of the major death marches, and all of the maps I showed you here are available through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I want to say to you that in the course of this presentation, there was a lot left unsaid. I chose to focus on the decision-making process that led Germany from seeking a territorial solution to carrying out the final solution. Um, it was the pivot of thinking they were going to win the war to realizing that they were not going to win it. It was in the context of that transition that the decision to commit genocidal mass murder occurred. There's a lot of historical debate on exactly when that moment came, and was the decision made in the last moments of euphoria when they thought victory was in their grasp, or in the first moments of impending realization that they were going to lose the war, or at least not win it. And there's plenty of room to debate those points. Um, but I hope that this presentation gave you a little bit more clarity on how the transition to the final solution happened, and a very, very brief look at the methods that the Nazis used to carry it out. Certainly, if you have any questions, ask me in the session on Friday morning, or ask them in your daily assignment and send them to me, and I'll be happy to respond. And I thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation.